being the worst products, the products that I don't really recommend. On this side, of course, we've got all the monitors that we will be ranking. There's a couple of different pages here that we have to get through. As I said, we've got 34 monitors to test in this video, or at least 34 monitors to rank. As is the case with our previous tier list videos, it's not really meant to be a monitor recommendation guide or a review process for each of these products. We have got dedicated reviews for all of these monitors right here on Monitors Unboxed. And if you want to see more of the recommendation videos as well, we've got those too. You know, best monitor videos, best 4K, best 1440p. Those are the sorts of videos that go more into the value of the products, comparisons, those sorts of things. This is purely about ranking them based on performance, value, that sort of thing. So, like usual, we'll be focusing mostly on the US market when it comes to any pricing discussion, but it's really more about the quality of the product overall. How is it being positioned in the market at launch? How have we reviewed it? And we'll be placing them into the tiers as is necessary. So let's get started with the very first cab off the rank, the Acer Nitro XV275 UP3, which as you can see here is a 27-inch 1440p 170Hz VA monitor. This is one of those mini LED options that we tested at the start of 2024. This has a 384 zone full array local dimming backlight. It's not the best monitor though. There were a few issues with this one. Being a VA LCD, it did have some dark smearing. It wasn't overly bad in that area. Excellent brightness, good contrast for HDR, that sort of thing. But it did have mediocre accuracy. It did have some scan lines. And my main issue with this product was its terrible on-screen display. That was both slow, and when you wanted to change between the SDR and HDR modes, you had to do a lot of fiddling around with the settings. So it wasn't the worst product if you wanted an HDR experience at a relatively low price, but I think it's been beaten by some of the products that we've tested throughout the rest of the year. So it's not a product that I would recommend. I think I'd probably initially put this in the D tier, potentially E tier, but certainly not above D tier. It's not a product I ended up recommending. So this is C tier is probably average, it's probably a bit below that. So I think D tier makes sense for now. The Asus ROG Swift OLED PG34W CDM. This is the first OLED monitor of many that will be featured in this tier list. It's a 34-inch 1440p class 21:9 aspect ratio, of course, 240Hz W OLED monitor. So this is the first ultra-wide OLED that we'd seen that pushed up to 240Hz, which did give it an advantage for motion clarity relative to those 175Hz QD OLEDs that we'd seen earlier in the year, or at least the previous years. Unfortunately, because it was a W OLED, it did feature reduced text clarity, which was somewhat of an issue compared to those QD OLEDs. And my main issue with this was more its aggressive 800R curve. I much prefer for an ultra-wide format the 1800R curves that we use for most of the QD OLEDs. 800R reduces its usability for things outside of gaming. So if you wanted to use this for productivity tasks or web browsing, that sort of thing, 800R isn't ideal. Also a matte coating, whether or not you think that's an issue compared to QD OLED is of course divisive, but another issue with this one is that it was just far too expensive at launch. It was way more expensive than those 175, 165Hz QD OLEDs like the Alienware AW3423 DWF that we'd recommended a lot, so that made it hard to recommend. I think from a hardware perspective, it's not the worst product. Like if you're interested in OLED gaming, it is pretty good in terms of its HDR performance, response times, that sort of thing. So I think if we put into the D tier, that would be incredibly harsh. But C tier, yeah, it's just a fairly average monitor, nothing super well going for it. Over here, the next up, we have the Samsung Odyssey OLED G95 SC, otherwise known as the OLED G9. This is one of the super ultra wides that we've got in our rankings for 2024. So 49 inches, 1440p class resolution, 32:9 aspect ratio, 240Hz QD OLED. So it's equivalent to, say, two 27-inch 1440p monitors stitched together. One of the benefits this one had was that it offered the full 240Hz refresh rate, which we didn't get with some of those other 49-inch ultra wides, which makes it easier to recommend in some of those models. It did have a couple of issues though, didn't really work well with AMD GPUs at launch. I believe that's been fixed since then. Did have relatively poor factory calibration, and while you could fix that through the extensive calibration features provided by its smart TV functionality, it had a lot of bloat in there as well, so the interface wasn't the best to navigate. That said, I think if you were interested in buying a 49-inch 240Hz QD OLED monitor for, say, a sim racing setup or some sort of immersive single-player gaming experience, or even multiplayer, those sim games can be for multiplayer as well, but I think I probably would still recommend the OLED G9 despite some of those issues, and it's been relatively well priced throughout most of the year. It's been keeping up with pricing trends. It started off very expensive. It's come down a bit since then. So I feel like based on all those factors, this is probably a B tier monitor. Yeah, it's probably better than the C tier PG34 WCDM that we've put in, but I wouldn't necessarily class it in those upper two tiers for now. So we'll keep it in the B tier. Maybe if as we go, we'll adjust some of these rankings, which has been also the case in some of our previous videos. Next up, we've got the AOC Q27G3XMN. And this is one of the monitors that featured in a lot of our buying guides throughout 2024. It has very impressive HDR performance at the price. So usually you could buy this for $280 US. One of the issues, of course, is you can't actually buy it in a lot of regions. But if you are in a region where AOC is selling this monitor, $280 US is a fantastic price for this level of HDR performance with 336 backlight zones. Of course, it is a 27-inch 1440p 180Hz VA LCD, so being a VA, there are some issues with speed, motion performance, that sort of thing. It wasn't the fastest monitor going around. It did have some dark level smearing, but generally speaking, if you wanted that HDR monitor for single-player games, then this is a great choice in this sub $300 price class. Peak brightness exceeded 1000 nits. Great contrast. There was some blooming, some HDR flickering, so it's not a premium tier experience. But I feel like for the price, the overall package that you're getting, not a lot of other monitor brands were even competitive with this in terms of its HDR performance. So I think based on that, immediately we're probably looking at the higher two tiers. I don't think it's S tier just because there are some flaws with it. Motion performance, as I said, blooming, that sort of thing. But certainly it deserves to be in the A tier at the very least. If there was a lot more competition for these sort of, I guess, good HDR experiences at this price point, then maybe you'd see it slotting down into the further tiers because you'd want to see like maybe an IPS LCD or something that was competitive, bring you that better motion performance. But just because it is one of the best value products for HDR and one of the only good value 1440p HDR monitors that are LCD based, then I feel like A tier is certainly justified for this AOC monitor. Shortly after reviewing that AOC, I reviewed another AOC product. This is the 24G4, so fairly basic 24-inch 1080p 180Hz IPS LCD here. We've seen a lot of these 24-inch 1080p monitors from AOC over the years, and the G4 model was slightly better than its predecessors. So good speed for gaming, low input lag, wide gamut support, which you don't always get with these more entry-level 1080p monitors. Excellent factory calibration was a real surprise for this sort of price class. But obviously it's a more basic product, so no directional OSD, more basic inputs, mediocre peak brightness for SDR, of course. But one of the real selling points of this was its good price. So it launched at around $150 US and it's become cheaper over the year. I think you can now get it more around $120, or at least that was the case for Black Friday sales. So if you were looking for this entry-level product for 1080p gaming, I would still recommend the 24G4, and I think it does a really good job in that price class. So immediately that has me thinking probably A tier behind the Q27G3XMN. So we'll go through and rank the orders of these in each of the tiers. But I feel like for now, we're probably looking at A tier for this particular product. And I think it's one of the products I recommend in the best monitors video in that sort of entry-level price class. And certainly what you find when you're looking sub $150 is that there's a lot of competition. But when you start getting to those really low price points around $120, you start to see those VA LCDs, just products that aren't as good, lower refresh rate models as well. And because this is an IPS LCD at 180 Hz, you're still getting great motion performance, which is what a lot of people will be looking for on a gaming monitor. So based on that, I think A tier is probably justified. Now we get into a long line of QD OLED monitors, a lot of the 4K models that we tested throughout this year, so lots of OLEDs in this video. The first of which, the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG32 UCDM. So this was, of course, the first 32-inch 4K 240Hz QD OLED that I tested on the channel. And, I mean, let's just say straight away, we're putting this in the S tier because I think these 4K QD OLED monitors are excellent products. And while there is a bit of variation between the models that we've seen throughout the year, I think I've tested 3 or 4 of them so far. Actually, it could even be 5, so we'll see how we go throughout this video. But basically, if you want a premium tier gaming monitor, you should be buying a 4K 32-inch QD OLED or some sort of OLED in this price class. They are excellent for gaming. They have fantastic speed. A lot of them are really well calibrated for both the SDR and HDR mode, so whether or not you're using it for, say, SDR productivity tasks, watching videos, that sort of thing, playing competitive games at 240Hz, or playing single player games with that brilliant HDR experience thanks to OLED, per pixel control, high brightness, that sort of thing. You're really getting all of that in this one package here. The Asus model has some specific advantages. It added Dolby Vision support later through a firmware update, which works okay. Has an unlocked sRGB mode to go along with its great SDR calibration, so you can tweak things a little bit if you need to adjust performance there. Good feature set in terms of its ports and other aspects to the OSD features and that sort of thing. But generally, the performance of these QD-OLED panels is excellent. And if you want that high-tier experience, that premium experience for around $1,000, then you should be going for this Asus model, or at least one of these QD-OLEDs. The Asus model is a little more expensive than some of the others that I've tested throughout the year, but I think this is mitigated by the fact that it has a great feature set, and it's probably the best of the 4K QD OLEDs that I've tested. So based on that, I still think its S-tier position is deserved. In addition to that, we've also got the MSI MPG 321 URX. So this is again 32-inch 4K 240Hz QD OLED, very similar to the Asus model in terms of its overall features and performance. So if you're looking for, again, very similar HDR performance, very similar SDR performance, motion performance is identical using the same OLED panel, of course. So all of those factors mean that this QD OLED delivers a great experience as well. So the Asus model is slightly better in terms of its HDR, so a little better tuning there. But the MSI makes up for this with a lower price point, has a few more OLED care features as well. But really that lower price point is only applicable in the US. Throughout the year, we've seen great pricing for this model if you're able to buy one off Newegg or one of those areas. But if you live in Australia or in Europe or one of those other countries, then it's priced much closer to the Asus model. So based on this, I think it's also an S-tier product just because of its overall performance, but lower than the PG32 UCDM, if that makes sense. I'm saying that because the PG32 UCDM is probably the better monitor overall, slightly based on its feature set. And also, if the 321 URX was the better value product worldwide, like everywhere it was offering that $950 US price versus what was the Asus model, like $1,200, $1,300. If it was offering that sort of price difference everywhere, then I'd probably think the MSI model could be the higher tier of those two products. But because the Asus model is better and pricing is very similar in a lot of regions, I think I'd put the Asus ahead. But both are S-tier products. If you get one, you should have been very happy with its performance, and both have been supported well through firmware updates. Another 4K QD OLED model that we've got here for ranking, but one that is slightly different to the other models that we've tested so far, is the Dell Alienware AW3225QF. So again, 4K, 240Hz, QD OLED, 32 inches in size, but the main difference here is that it is a curved panel. So if you wanted a curved panel, this is the monitor to get. There's not a lot of options. I think MSI has just announced a new curved version as well, but if you really like a curved screen, then the AW3225QF would have been the monitor to get. It is very similar to the PG32 UCDM, the 321 URX that we've talked about previously in terms of its performance. So again, very similar motion performance. Again, great factory calibration, very strong accuracy with this one. And it did have a good feature set with things like Dolby Vision support included out of the box. So there are, of course, issues with Dolby Vision and Windows that make it less suitable for Windows-based gaming. But it also lacks some features like a KVM switch or USB-C. One of the main things that the Dell models got going for it was that it had great pricing worldwide. So if you wanted a lower cost 4K QD OLED option, in a lot of regions, the Dell model was actually the cheapest version. So that meant that it was really good value. I guess from my perspective, based on its performance, its overall quality and everything like that, we'd be looking at S-tier performance because it's very similar to the MSI and Asus models that we've been talking about. Now, my preference is certainly for the flat model over the curved model. So based on that, I think I'd probably bump it down to the A tier just because I prefer a flat screen. But then the value angle, you could almost argue it back up into the S tier because in a lot of regions, this would have been the best value option, an option that a lot of people purchased. So whether or not it's like at the end of the S tier or at the upper A tier is up for debate, in my opinion. I think if I was going based on my preferences, I would be putting this in the A tier because of its curve. And I think that's probably the deciding factor for me. So I'd have it clearly ahead of these. So let's just move the Q27G3XMN. Let's slot in the Alienware model there. I think this is probably what we're looking at in terms of the rankings as I see it, but it could certainly be in the S tier as well. I think it's a pretty dicey one there. We'll see how the tier rankings go as we go throughout this video. Next up, we're getting some of the 27-inch 1440p 360Hz QD OLED options, starting with the MSI MPG 271 QRX. This offered a very similar experience to a lot of the QD OLEDs that we've been talking about so far. So very fast performance, and at 360 hertz at the time, this was the fastest OLED that you can get. It was superseded by 480 hertz W OLEDs later in the year. But earlier in the year, if you wanted the best performance, then these 360 hertz QD OLEDs were it. So the MSI model has great accuracy. MSI did also offer it at a great price, so it offered really good value. And compared to a lot of the 1440p W OLED monitors that we'd seen, especially in 2023, this model does have better text clarity.